At least for this week, I think Tennessee deserves an upgrade. Clemson, you didn't do anything wrong, but we're going to take you down a notch. And Washington will keep you right there. It was close. It was very close for you to be able to attain the upper shelf there, but you didn't get it done. All right, everyone. Upset Saturday. How'd you like it? Well, some of you loved it because your team pulled off the upsets. Others, you're down in the dumps. And for some of us, we just kicked back and enjoyed the fun because it was a whole lot of fun for college football fans across the board, or if you just love the drama of big-time athletes and big-time sports. That's college football at its best. We had upsets all over the place, starting actually on Friday night with Texas Tech upsetting 7.5-point favorite TCU. And so that was a big game for the Red Raiders to get us started on upset alert as they stayed in contention for the Big 12 championship. And actually, with all the theatrics and everything going on in the Big 12, that was one of the lesser of the upset-riddled conferences on this day, although there was a big one, of course, with Will Grier and West Virginia going on. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, coming your way as we wrap it up on a Saturday, week 7, with USC in good shape with 13 minutes left, leading Colorado 28-7. College football being what it is in 2018, we wouldn't normally put a wrap on a top 20 team only down by 3 touchdowns with 13 minutes left in the game. But if you have caught any of this game, you know that USC has completely and thoroughly dominated this game. Even though JT Daniels played a pretty awful first quarter and a half, tried to give Colorado some points, he couldn't do so because his defense just wouldn't let him. Colorado has been completely bottled up. Trayvon McMillan on the ground doing nothing. Steven Montez at one point had 17 completions. I don't know that I've ever heard a stat like this. 17 completions for 78 yards passing. Everything was underneath, nothing downfield. USC let them grab it and then wrapped them up and would throw them down for about a 2-yard gain. The USC defense has been dominant, and they have proven once again we've got a classic case scenario of a particular team having a team that's making progress under Mike McIntyre this season at 5-0, having defeated a lot of teams that are kind of on their level and winning impressively against those teams. But now that they've raised the level of play, they took their team on the road and they get completely outclassed. 28-7 USC. On to other matters as I strike up the live stream, and we'll certainly get your feedback on the live chat. Hey, there's a call. You guys were right on cue on that one. I was just about to say 860-325-3687. And there comes the call. So we shall take it. This is Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Who do we have on the line?
Hey, Mark, it's DeAndre. How you doing?
Hey, DeAndre, we can credit DeAndre with partially being responsible for this live stream. He basically was the executive producer for this live stream as he called for it. And I said, well, I was still kind of wavering. Should I wrap up the day? Should I talk about Miami and anything else regarding this thing in college football? And DeAndre, you kind of pushed me over the edge to get back on here. How you doing tonight?
Man, I lost a lot of money this week.
Uh-oh.
Texas Tech and TCU. I knew Texas Tech defense was improved, but I didn't think that they'll shut TCU down because TCU scored 28 on Ohio State. So I thought it was going to be a high-scoring game, but I was wrong. You know, sometimes I need to go with my gut. But I wish I would put more money on that UVA and Miami game because I called that one right down the line. I knew UVA was going to beat Miami. It's not because I think Miami's a terrible team, but they have put so much emotion in that comeback against Florida State. And if Florida State didn't turn over those 2 turnovers to get Miami back in the game, Florida State would have beat them. But I just saw it coming. The UVA gave them a hard time last year. And man, this has been an exciting weekend. I'll take those losses that I took. I got to pay a lot of money out, but it was a great weekend.
Well, DeAndre, I don't know if it's going to make you feel any better, but I had a great week. Even though I missed all these games tonight against the spread, I was so far ahead that I had a great day, and it turned out pretty well for me this particular week. But you know how that goes. You can't get too puffed up because there's another week coming.
Yeah. Yeah, man. It's been amazing. And there's a couple games I wish I had a chance to bet on. But anyway, I want to talk about I forgot who I called to talk to you about. But I don't really know why Miami fans were so high on Perry, the quarterback for Miami. I just didn't see it. Even when they said, "Wow, we blew out UNC," and they were like, "We back, I'm back." Like, UNC is terrible, and he didn't do anything in the second half to make you say, "Wow, this is a great quarterback." I mean, I just don't see how they get so hyped on like beating Savannah State and Florida International. They're really not that good on the offensive line. And I was telling some of the guys that, and it was killing me on Twitter. They was like, "You just a Miami hater and all that stuff." I said, "Man, do y'all watch the game? Miami and Florida State offensive line is terrible, no matter how much talent they got." And I just didn't see it. Like some of them guys saw it. And I just said, man, these guys, if they play Clemson or Alabama with the offensive lines, they're gonna get murdered. I just don't see it.
DeAndre, I was prepared. Day, yeah, DeAndre, I was prepared to come on here tonight and tell it like it is concerning Miami football, but I think you did it for me.
Yeah.
So I've ranked. Yeah, I have ranked Miami. Again, I don't do a preseason poll because I allow the play on the field to dictate where I rank teams. So I don't do a preseason poll. Maybe I should because people like to see that. But once they played LSU, I knocked them right out of the top 25, and then they barely worked themselves in. And as you can imagine, and you may have seen some of the comments, I took a beating for the last 5 or 6 weeks about where I ranked Miami. And as you just pointed out, they haven't beaten anyone. They haven't beaten anybody decent, let alone a really good team. They haven't beaten a decent team. They haven't beaten a Duke, or they haven't beaten a Georgia Tech even. They haven't even beaten a decent team yet, let alone, they haven't beaten a Syracuse or an NC State or anybody of that ilk. They have a lot of bad wins.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to tell them. And it's like no disrespect to Miami. They was a great program, and they still are a great program. I'm sure Mark Richt is going to turn that place around. But this is not the 80s and the 90s or the early 2000s where you could just stock low talent and you just out talent everybody, because a lot of those people that's in South Florida, they are going to Florida Atlantic or Florida International or
Central Florida.
or what's the other, South Florida. I mean, you got so many other schools that you go to, and even back when my uncle played in the 80s and 90s, Clemson was getting players out of Florida. I mean, if you ever go back and look at Florida State teams, before Nick Saban got to LSU, Florida State was getting people out of that panhandle area, Louisiana, like Ward Dunn was from there. I think the other person named Vandover. I mean, they were getting players out of everywhere back then, but it's kind of harder now because more people are staying close to the home, and you got so many more colleges, so they can't stop those talent like they used to. And but like I said, I think they're gonna get together one day, but I don't think they're gonna be Miami of the 80s or the early 90s or the early 2000s, what you saw. I mean, sometimes you just gotta look at it. I mean, like you got on me about saying something about Florida and Vanderbilt. I mean, Florida was doing the same thing. You know, they just out-talented a lot of teams. They were good teams, but they just out-talented. You can't do that anymore. You got to show up every week to beat some of these, even the small schools. When Clemson lost to Syracuse last year, I told people I saw it coming because Clemson had beat, 5 ranked teams in a matter before October 1st. Their quarterback was hurt. The kicker got hurt. the defense wasn't as deep as it is this year, and you just saw it coming. I mean, some of these games you see coming by the way they play. You saw Clemson losing. I ain't gonna say I saw them losing the Pitt, but Clemson had played awful up to that Pitt game. They were just barely getting by. They got by with NC State and a couple other games. So you got to bring your A game every weekend. It's kind of hard now because you have to play 12 games, then a conference championship game. So you're gonna have those letdowns sometimes, and that's how it happens. But like I said, I think Miami and a couple of those other schools, they're gonna be back one day, but they're not gonna be as dominant as they once was. And it's gonna be hard to replicate what they did in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and that's all of them. Florida State. And one day somebody's gonna catch up with Alabama. It's gonna happen. Clemson ain't gonna be this good like they are now, and maybe in a couple years and stuff like that. It's gonna happen. So everybody needs to just take their lumps and just be patient with their program, which is not gonna happen in our society today.
So the deal with Miami is, for the past decade to 15 years, they've been largely irrelevant on a national scale, competing for championships, and that can't be disputed. It's obvious they have not competed even for ACC championships, let alone national championships. Now, Miami supporters would say that they're the type program that's always relevant, and I understand that argument. Texas could say the same thing, and we could go down the list of teams and programs that could state, even when we're down, we're relevant because we've built up such a brand over generations. Alabama had a 3-8, Notre Dame and Ohio State and Michigan, and on and on and on. And some younger viewers may be shocked to know that Alabama had a 3-8 season in this century. Only about 12 or 13 years ago, Alabama went 3-8. Was Alabama still relevant? Yes, on one hand, they were still relevant because of their storied tradition, but in that particular time frame, were they relevant to what was going on competing for championships in the SEC and beyond? Absolutely not. Of course not. And that's where Miami is right now. Now they're in better shape than 3-8. I'm not comparing them to that Alabama team. They won a bad division last year. They could still possibly win a bad division this year, arguably the worst division in college football. I would rank it second or third worst, something in that range. It's, I think, a little bit exceeded possibly by the Pac-12 South division, but the Coastal Division in the ACC is not good. And Miami still, they've only lost one game in conference, so they could still win the conference or win the division and get to the conference championship game. Okay, so let's look at the pluses and minuses. So the pluses are, or the minuses, let's start with that last 10 to 15 years. They've been, again, irrelevant in regards to winning and competing for championships. That can't be debated because they haven't. But they've been relevant in regards to stockpiling talent and in terms of the brand name with the 5 national titles and so forth. Yes. Mark Richt comes in. He upgrades the recruiting. The recruiting has been much better over the last 2 or 3 years than it was previously. Much of that has to do with Mark Richt. Some of that also has to do with recruiting violations that have dropped off from the past, and them dealing with the violations and so forth that they've had to deal with. So they are extremely talented in a lot of positions on their team. They've had an excellent linebacking core for the last few years. They've had an excellent defensive front for the last few years. Not as good as Clemson, not as good as Alabama, but a really good defensive front that's probably one of the 10 or 15 best in the country, and front 7. And the secondary's been, I would say, overrated. I know that it's considered extremely good, but I also know that Wisconsin tore to shreds in the Orange Bowl last year, and Wisconsin does not have elite playmakers on the outside, and they shredded Miami's secondary. The Miami quarterbacking situation has been an obvious talking point on this show for a long, long time, and has been an issue. And the offensive line, as you have stated, is not good at all. They have very good running backs who make their own way. I think DJ Dallas is a really good back, maybe not a feature elite back, but he's a plow horse, and he makes his own way. The wide receiver core has been extremely good. So they're really, really good in spots, but the offensive line and the quarterback generally are holding them back. And the one thing I will say about their defense is the defense, of course, giving up 16 points and not getting much help from the offense, did not lose the game tonight. But DeAndre, when your offense had just scored a touchdown to make it a 16-13 game, if you're a Clemson fan, being a Clemson fan, and you seeing your offense struggle, let's say, and let's say this is a couple weeks ago with Syracuse on the other side of the field, and you knew that your defense needed to bail out your quarterback situation, which was struggling, and you had just scored a touchdown to get back in the game, and the team that you're playing, Virginia, is one-dimensional. They have very little threat of throwing the ball downfield, and you allow them to drive the ball 80 yards down your throat with the game on the line. Now, they did complete some underneath passes that were key in that drive, but Virginia took the ball and shoved it down Miami's throats and sealed that game in the last 5 minutes. They couldn't take the ball away from them. And I was on here doing a live stream at halftime, and it got into the third quarter, and I said, Miami's only going to get the ball back like twice in the second half because Virginia is just milking this clock, and they are winning the battle up front and grinding the clock down to sawdust. And that's what they did to win the game. And you can't, if you've got an elite defense, then you get off the field.
Right. I was sick last week, so I couldn't talk about the Clemson Syracuse game. But a lot of Miami fans were like, well, y'all almost lost to Syracuse. But if you go back and look at that Syracuse game, and Bryce, I think his name Bryce, he was the sixth-string quarterback coming into the season. So everybody transferred, and it was just
Sure.
Lawrence. But if you look at that game, Clemson turned it over inside his own 20 twice. And that's how Syracuse scored their 2 touchdowns. And, that's what I'm saying. A lot of times, turnovers play a big part in the game. We all know that. Look how many times Ole Miss beat Alabama because Alabama turned the ball like 5 or 6 times in the whole game.
Sure.
So, the turnovers play a big part of it. But I think, like I said, it's not a knock on Miami, but these offensive lines all across the country just need to improve. I watched Ohio State today, and I said, man, these guys don't have a chance. And I thought that quarterback was way better than what they had in the past. I'm like, God, somebody blocked somebody. I mean, I've never seen Ohio State offensive line look that bad against a school like Minnesota. Not saying Coach Fleck can't coach, but I mean, the offensive line looks terrible. They couldn't run the ball, couldn't throw the ball. These offensive lines around the country have to get better. And I know it's a limited amount of practice time, but Jesus Christ, I mean, you don't get somebody hurt.
It's very true, DeAndre. So I didn't see the Ohio State game. I was visiting my daughter this afternoon. I DVR'd the game, and we had Steve Hellwagon on from Bucknuts yesterday to talk Ohio State football. I did see the Buckeyes game last week against Indiana, and Indiana's got a decent defense, but it's not going to compete for a championship, and Ohio State couldn't run against them. They only obliterated that Indiana defense because they had too much speed on the outside and a quarterback who could tear them to shreds, but they couldn't move them off the ball. And that's the first thing that I heard back from today's game was Ohio State couldn't run the ball. And that's alarming for Ohio State football fans. If they can't run against Minnesota and Indiana, then they have some serious problems because they've got Michigan State and they've got Michigan at the end of the year. And, of course, you as a Clemson fan knows what an Ohio State offense is going to look like if it can't block anybody up front, because you saw it 2 years ago.
They are terrible, man. I don't get it. Maybe because of all this short hours of practice time, but they really. I looked at them like, Jesus Christ, this is Ohio State. Cause I bet on that game. I know you think you shouldn't bet that big spread.
Yep.
But I had cheesed it down to 10, and I said, well, maybe they'll win by 20. And I was just like, Jesus Christ, they can't do nothing against Minnesota.
Oh, so which way did you go on that game?
I teased it down. I took 30 points, but I teased it down to 20 because I was trying to win.
Okay.
So I teased it down to 10. So I thought, well, they'll win by 20-something points.
Sure.
If not 30. And that game just ruined me because that's the only reason why I watched it. That's the only way you get me to watch a Minnesota-Ohio State game. And I was just shocked how terrible the offensive line. I didn't even see the Indiana game. If I saw the Indiana game, I probably wouldn't have bet on that Minnesota Ohio State game. But I was just amazed that Ohio State had that much trouble, especially with those two good running backs and all the speed they got on the offensive line. They got a quarterback that can throw the ball down the field. I was really, really shocked on how bad Ohio State offensive line looked. And it's sad to see it that way. Cause I know that quarterback they got, he's going to leave after this year. So there ain't no other good quarterbacks out there outside the kid at Oregon that could probably rival him in the NFL draft. So I know somebody's going to buy him, go ahead and leave because he got a strong arm. But those guys can't block nobody. And their two running backs were good. I remember watching the guy that was a freshman last year, not Weber, but the other one.
J.K. Dobbins.
He ran all over Indiana. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a really good player. Yeah, well, Weber's more of an inside the tackles horse, more of a bull that breaks tackles, that doesn't have the breakaway speed. Not that he's not fast, but J.K. Dobbins is the guy that can cut and shift on a dime. They're both really good backs. J.K. Dobbins is one of the top 5 to 10 backs in the nation, and Weber's probably one of the top 20 or 25. Yeah, they're both really good. But yeah, if they can't block, if they don't get that figured out, and as you know, the recruiting rankings tell us that all those guys were highly recruited, so they apparently have the talent to do it. So they've got issues up front, whatever it is, missed assignments or whatever it is, guys haven't developed in the weight room. I don't know what it is, but they either won't beat Michigan because Michigan is one of the best defensive fronts in the country, or they'll trick their way around Michigan and they'll get to the playoff and then they'll have some issues. Although everybody's got their flaws, DeAndre. So when you said that people were making fun of you and talking about Syracuse taking you guys to the wire, you let them know who hasn't gotten a little bit of a scare this year. That I can think of one team, and that's Alabama. And that's because they're so good, but it's also because they haven't played anybody. So the best team that they played was probably Missouri today. Texas A&M would be the best team that they've played. And they beat them by like 20, 22 points. But everybody's gotten some level of a scare. Everybody. You can't take a team in the country. Oklahoma, Ohio State, Clemson, Georgia, obviously lost today by 20 points. Everybody's gotten a scare, if not a loss. So that's a ridiculous comment to make. Now, if you say, you got 6 scares every week, you're going out there beating Wake Forest by a field goal and BC by 2. And if it happens every week, that's another story.
Right. Yeah, because it was game and this is my first year of betting like I do. That Army Oklahoma game really showed me you got to really, really do your research. I said, man, Oklahoma's going to run through these guys. They don't have the athletes that Oklahoma has. But it's like Dean Smith used to do with the 4 corners. You may not have the talent to run with you, but we're going to spread the ball around and make sure you can't catch our Princeton. You can't catch us, and that's what Army did to Oklahoma.
Sure.
And I know a lot of people that bet on that game was bad because I think Oklahoma was like a 30-point favorite.
Yep. And
I was like, that Army kept it close, and I didn't win the overtime, didn't I? So, but Mark, you have a great night, and I'll be listening in on the show. And hopefully we'll see some more good football this coming up week. And don't get to work so I can pay my debtors.
So DeAndre, I hate to hear that, but we will give you some information as soon as you get off the phone. I'm going to run some numbers for you on some of the lines and what's happened over the first 7 weeks of the season that may help you out a little bit.
Yes, sir.
I've got it right in front of me. Okay, DeAndre. Thanks for the call, man. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye. It's our guy, DeAndre. He roots for Clemson. He really follows the ACC, but he looks around college football, and he tells it like it is, and he does a nice job commenting, and he urged me to do the live stream, which I most likely still would have done because with all the upsets, and I try to put a wrap on each and every Saturday. But DeAndre, if you're listening, so going into week 7, this is week 7. I picked 143 college football games. So I take all the top 25 games, plus a few of the games outside the top 25 that are relevant. So, for example, today I still picked the Iowa-Indiana game and the Virginia Tech-North Carolina game just because I wanted to. They're just outside the top 25. But basically, the top 25 games. I got 114 right, 29 wrong. That's straight up. And that's easy to do. So I should hit 82%, which I typically do. I'm just under that right now. Going into the week, I was at 70 right, 56 wrong against the spread. That's about 56%. Okay, DeAndre, I'm going to urge you to drop any games that are 3 touchdowns or more. Don't think about them. Don't touch them. Okay. If you run my numbers, I'm 70 and 56 against the spread, but I'm only 22 and 22 in games of 3 touchdown spreads or more. Because you know why? You're guessing. You're guessing what's going to happen. It's a non-competitive game. Vegas has basically determined this game's not going to be competitive. Therefore, if Vegas is right and it's a non-competitive game, then how can you predict what's going to be going on in the fourth quarter? You don't know who's going to be on the field. You don't know how hard they're going to be playing. You don't know how the coaches are going to coach. Some coaches are going to say, you know what? We're up 30. I want to win by 50. Keep throwing the ball. We're going to put our heel on their throat and stomp them out. Some coaches, let's get out of town. Let's get out of Dodge. If we give up 2 late touchdowns and only win by 20, who cares? Let's just cruise control. We're going to run off tackle. They'll stop us. They'll score some cheap touchdowns. Who cares? We win by 20 instead of by 35. Fine. The other thing is, when you talk about the effort of the athletes on the field, sometimes the teams that have the second and third teamers in the fourth quarter, those guys are actually playing harder than the other team because they want to make an impression for their coach. So sometimes the big favorite puts in the second and third teamers, and they're so good for a team like Clemson, Ohio State, Georgia, those kind of teams, is that they crush the other team even more in the fourth quarter. It's just unpredictable. And I ran this by our odds maker guy, Steve Merrill of Pro Sports Info, and he said it makes total sense, the numbers that you ran, that games over a 3 touchdown spread would be a complete toss-up. You're 22 and 22. That makes total sense. The games that are less than 3 touchdowns, I'm hitting on 59% of those against the spread. Okay. And then when you tease them down, DeAndre, I know that people love to do that because they like to play with stuff, but you're compromising your payback. So you might win that one, but you've got to win so many more times versus the one that you lose. There's a reason Vegas throws out things like parlays and teasers. They skew the odds in their favor. So over the long haul, I don't think that's the way to go. That's just me. I'm not a pro. All right. Also keep this in mind. Going into this week, and we'll count them up for this week as well. Going into week 7, I had picked 126 games against the spread. All top 25 games, a few outside the top 25. 126. 30 of those were flat out upsets. The team that was the underdog won the game straight out against the money line. 30 out of 126. That's a quarter of the games. So you need to go find upsets every week. There's about 5 or 6 upsets every week, even though it doesn't look that way when we look at the games and we think, where are the upsets going to be? Well, there's going to be 5 or 6 upsets every week. So because a number of top 25 teams played each other this week, I didn't predict as many games, but think about it. This week, how many upsets did we have? Auburn, a 14.5-point underdog, beat Tennessee. Do you know how much money that would pay off on a money line wager? A ton of money. LSU is a 7.5-point underdog. Believe me, I played it. Paid off in spades over Georgia. Therefore, if you nail enough of those games, then your percentage doesn't have to be very high. You can predict like 40% of the games right if you're eyeing upsets and you're going to win money. Does that make sense? Like today, I predicted 3 upsets. I picked South Carolina as a 3-point underdog to beat Texas A&M straight up. They didn't pull through for me, so lost that one. But the other two, I took LSU plus the 7.5, and I picked LSU to win the game outright. And I also took Oregon 3.5 points to win it outright over Washington. So the payoff, for example, on a $100 bet would be I would have lost $100 with South Carolina, Texas A&M. There's $100 out the door. But the LSU played like 260 for $100. So there's a 260. And then the Oregon over Washington was like 180. So 260, 180, 440 in the bank versus the $100 loss, 340 in my favor. So if you're predicting games, if you're looking at all the games, just keep in mind about 20 to 25% of those games are going to be upsets. So you better find them somewhere. Today, out of, I predicted 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 games. There were how many outright upsets? Auburn, 14.5 point underdog, or Tennessee beat Auburn. Tennessee, the 14.5 point underdog, beat Auburn. LSU, touchdown underdog, beat Georgia. Oregon, 3.5 point underdog, beat Washington. Michigan State, 13.5 point dog, beat Penn State. Now, I picked Michigan State to win against the points. I didn't pick them to win the game, and I seriously thought about it and should have. But I did pick them against the spread. There's 4. Iowa State, 6.5 point dog, beat West Virginia. Virginia, touchdown underdog, beat Miami. There's 6. And then on Friday night, Texas Tech is a touchdown underdog, beat TCU. 7 out of 18 games were won by substantial underdogs. 7 out of 18. That's like 40% plus. So they're there. And those are the ones that are really going to pay off for you. Take all that for whatever it's worth, but those are the numbers. So this year, I have predicted 25 upsets, and I've hit on 14 out of 25. That doesn't sound impressive until you consider that it's tough to pick upsets. 14 out of 25 pays off a ton. And I didn't have a great day, but it did rather well where it counts. But yeah, against the spread, I didn't do great. I was a little bit over 500. Upset Saturday, folks. Let's talk about them. Let's start with the SEC. LSU shows up and they take out Georgia. They were more physical. They limited the running game. Jake Fromm was miserable, 15 of 34, 209 through the air, a couple costly interceptions. The combination of Fulton and Greedy Williams at the corner spots really clamped down on the Georgia wide receivers. LSU, Joe Burrow at quarterback. He almost gave you the line that you expect out of Joe Burrow. He threw the ball away when he needed to. He didn't take any unnecessary risks. For 15 of 30, 200 yards flat, no touchdowns, no picks. Ran for a touchdown. The LSU running game was extremely good. And LSU at home against Georgia makes it very interesting. And I have just drawn up for the SEC, the Big Ten, and the ACC. I've got to do the Pac-12 and the Big 12 college football playoff scenarios. And, of course, the SEC gives us some very mighty interesting scenarios. The SEC champ will be in the playoff. Past that, winning and getting 2 teams into the playoff has become much more difficult now for the SEC. Not that it can't happen, but it's become much more difficult with Georgia losing. Georgia needed to win out and win the SEC championship game. They obviously could still do that as a one-loss team, but it gives us less factors between Alabama and Georgia. The most likely scenario for the SEC getting in 2 teams would have been Alabama winning out, Georgia winning out, and then a close SEC championship game that shows the nation and the College Football Playoff Selection Committee that the loser is still one of the top 4 teams. Well, with Georgia getting smoked at LSU, that's not going to happen now. They're not going to be undefeated going into the SEC championship game, and it's a lot less likely because they've got their own problems now getting through Florida and Kentucky. So anyway, we're going to cut some videos here in the next day outlining the college football playoff scenarios for the SEC, the ACC, and the Big Ten in particular, also the Big 12. And yes, we don't want to forget our folks out west with the Pac-12 on life support concerning a college football playoff. Their last chance basically is losing right now by 17 points, Colorado. Oregon, yes, they were impressive today. They beat a decent Washington, a very good Washington team in overtime. We'll have our top 25 out tomorrow. Boy, I'm going to have to do some work on that because that's going to be a free-for-all to figure out the top 25. But it's the top 25 that makes sense. It actually makes sense. But the more the games are played and the more games we have to look at, the more scenarios I have to compare, and it makes it more complicated as we go. In week one, I just ranked the teams based on how impressive their wins were against their opponent, and whoever beat the best teams and beat them the most impressively, I just order them, and then it becomes more complex from there. Now we're 6 to 7 games deep. The top 25 is going to take some time for me to figure out. I'm going to rank the conferences as well. Had that request from 288028. So I'm going to rate the conferences as well. I believe I've got a handle on that. If you'd like to join in, it's 860-325-3687. Otherwise, I'm just going to go through the scores and give you my take on these games. I will let you know, full disclosure, I didn't watch as much college football as I typically do, which is from noon until 2 in the morning, like 14 hours of it, because I had a nice day with my daughter until about 6:30 p.m. I came home. I caught the fourth quarter of the 3:30 games, and there was too much 3:30 football Eastern time for a college football junkie to take in because I was all over the place trying to figure out LSU, Georgia. Man, I really wanted to see this game, but it's already 16-3 and now 19-3. Washington, Oregon, Penn State, Michigan State. I was all over the place trying to catch football at 3:30 in the fourth quarter. And then, of course, tonight I was like Michigan, Wisconsin, bam. But that got out of hand. And, of course, the Miami storyline started to play out with the replacing of N'Kosi Perry at quarterback and then the team losing in Charlottesville against a marginal Virginia team. Iowa State winning against West Virginia was huge. Of course, Iowa State's 3-3 right now. They might get ranked by me tomorrow. They have beaten decisively West Virginia, Oklahoma State, and TCU on the road. That's a good 3 wins. Oklahoma State, TCU, and West Virginia for Iowa State. They've lost to Iowa. They lost to Oklahoma. And I forget their other loss. It was in conference. All right, we've got a call coming in. So, Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. And who do we have on the line?
Mark, man, it's Reasonable Guff. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
Doing okay.
Excellent.
Man, did I hear you say earlier that you picked LSU to win outright?
I did.
You and I may be the only 2 people on the whole earth who did that.
That aren't LSU fans. Yes.
Yeah. On no one on College Game Day gave them the time of day. Not a single person would even talk about the possibility. But I obviously watch both teams because I keep up with the SEC all around. But I mean, I just told people I had not seen much from Georgia's offense.
Yeah,
I thought that they'd be able to effectively move the ball on LSU. And while you can say the exact same thing about LSU's offense, the difference maker is I figured that because it was in Tiger Stadium that would give Joe Burrow, the energy to, make a few plays when he needed to. And he ended up doing a lot more than that in that game. I was actually very impressed that they won it so handily.
In Tiger Stadium, and also considering the defenses that LSU has played in comparison to Georgia, that you almost have to skew or alter your perspective on the offensive performance because of the defenses that they've played.
Yeah, I mean, LSU now has not only more experience, but just more flat out like really good wins than anybody in the country.
Absolutely.
I mean, if that Florida loss wasn't a ding on their schedule, I would actually expect them to be number one in the actual polls, come tomorrow or Monday, whenever they're released.
Yes.
I mean, and they would deserve it. I mean, completely.
I did have them number one before they lost to Florida. Now, the thing that I have to guard against, and I think most of us have to guard against, and I had to guard against this early in the week when I was thinking about Georgia LSU, and I don't take a whole lot of time making these predictions because I'm doing all this other business. But the actual predictions, I kind of look at the game and compare a few scores and think about it for about 30 seconds. But I still had to rid my mind of preseason bias that Georgia is one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the country, and that LSU is more like a top 20 team that's going to go 7-5. I still had to and just think about exactly what you just said. What have I watched this season? I've seen LSU go to Auburn, and I know Auburn's not great, and they've struggled the last few weeks, but still, what have I seen out of LSU against quality competition in the SEC plus Miami versus what have I seen out of Georgia? And this game's going to be in Death Valley. And forget about the preseason projections and that the rankings say that Georgia's number 3 in the country, because if they had any other name on their jersey, if their name on the jersey said Vanderbilt and they did what they did this year, they'd probably be 23rd in the country or something like that.
Yeah, you're completely right. I actually never did have to deal with that whole preseason bias against LSU. I never really quite understood it. Well, like I said, I think people just don't trust Coach O for some weird reason. But they came out of the gate swinging. They throttled Miami. They beat the Auburn wins, not helping them right now, thanks to Auburn today. But yeah, I just saw. I honestly saw 2 kind of evenly matched teams throughout these when comparing Georgia and LSU this year. Georgia's been scoring more points, but they faced a lot less competition. And because it was in Tiger Stadium, and I think LSU may have been playing with a bit of a chip on their shoulder, and that just really just gave them everything they needed. And I got to say, I was kind of surprised, not really surprised, but a little surprised at Kirby's stubbornness to continue to play Jake Fromm. I really thought that he was going coming in the third quarter when the game was starting to get away from them, that he would have just put Justin Fields in and just see what happens. Because I mean, what he was doing wasn't working. From I think Kirby may have just a little bit too much of Nick Saban in him,
and Mark Richt
when it comes to
and Urban Meyer possibly. And so we're naming some really good football coaches, but they're, yeah, obviously the relationship, I understand the relationship, that's where that mindset would come from, would be Saban. I was just naming 2 other coaches that have shown in recent years a reluctance to go to the more talented quarterback because of loyalty or just a reliance on the leadership aspect.
Yeah, but I'm not. What do you even do now? Because if there was a time to try switching them out, it would have been today at that game. But I kind of wonder what he's going to do going forward, because this really makes things really interesting as far as the SEC East goes, because you got 3 potential takers to go to Atlanta in December. You got Kentucky, Georgia, and Florida. Here's where Georgia's running uphill. Florida and Kentucky have already played each other, and that's already settled. The only one in that triangle who's been left out so far is Georgia, and they have to travel to Kentucky, and they have to go. You know what? They go to Jacksonville, Florida. They call that a neutral site game, but it's not. So it's like 2 hours away from the Florida campus. So, in my opinion, they pretty much have 2 road games, and I would be kind of shocked if they ended up winning both of them, because I think there's a good possibility that Alabama gets to Atlanta in December, looks across the field, and there are blue jerseys over there instead of red.
What you are talking about, Reasonable Gump, I was talking about a few weeks ago, just in terms of a scenario. I wasn't necessarily making a prediction that Kentucky was going to Atlanta. I remember you stating that on a call with me a couple weeks ago, but I was just basically playing out scenarios, saying Kentucky has shown us something after they had beaten a couple decent opponents. And I had a number of people comment about how ridiculous it was, and that Georgia was a lock. And now Kentucky has played better football than Georgia. I know that the roster's not as talented, but we see teams win divisions every year that aren't as talented as other teams in the division. That happens all the time. And Kentucky's playing some good football. So is Florida playing pretty well. And you're right.
Well, yeah, you'll notice I said you'll notice I said blue jerseys. I didn't name a team because Kentucky and Florida are blue.
I instantly went to Kentucky. Yes, of course, blue jerseys. I've got my Florida on right now. It's more of a Florida than a Kentucky blue.
But yeah, that's a good football today. Honestly, a much better week for me than last week. I can just go. I will gladly trade an embarrassing Auburn on our schedule for a top 10 hopeful LSU when we get to play them.
Yeah, so they'll play Texas A&M, of course, after you. That's the last game of the season for them. They've got Mississippi State next, and that's the only team that we would expect could beat them. They've already beaten Ole Miss. Who else would they have? They already beat or they already played Florida, and they've got who else does LSU play in the Eastern Division? I'm trying to think. Georgia, Florida. There you go. So they're already done with those two. And so they've got to play Arkansas. So they're in good shape there. They've got Mississippi State next week. So are those the only 2 games before they don't play you guys until what? The 2nd or 3rd week in November, right?
Well, yeah, the first. It's next week. Alabama has Tennessee. I think LSU has Mississippi State. We both have an off week after that.
Okay.
The schedule. Our schedules always line up like that. We both have off weeks at the same time, and then we'll play each other the first week in November.
Okay, beautiful.
I think LSU has. Okay. I think LSU probably has 2 more non-conference games left. Maybe because they started their conference game, their play like early with Auburn. So,
yes.
I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah, they beat Louisiana Tech and somebody else. Yeah. Yeah, they've got 2 more, I believe. Nobody substantial, but yeah, 2 more. Yeah, it should be fun.
Well, anyway, yeah, that was probably the most entertaining part of the day. I couldn't help but laugh a little bit at Auburn blowing it to Tennessee. I still can't, though. I can't even really believe that actually happened. I know Auburn was on a downhill spiral, but losing to Tennessee, that's like losing to Rutgers. There's no excuse for that.
Well, yeah, no. Tennessee would annihilate Rutgers.
If you were experiencing the Tennessee of last year, you would understand my feelings like that.
Well, sure, I understand. I know that they crashed and burned at the end of the year, but they were still fairly competitive with some okay teams in the conference, unlike Rutgers. And this is where preseason bias killed me. I thought Auburn has to. I looked at that 14.5 points, and I thought, you know what? Auburn's really reeling. They have not played well for now 3 or 4 weeks. And I don't know if they're going to cover a couple touchdowns, but I thought, you know what? It's Auburn, and they'll be fine, and Tennessee's awful, and they should be able to cover that point spread. Nope. Couldn't even win the game. So is there anything that you can take from the Alabama game today? Was there any meaningful play in that?
So okay, so this game was at a lot. So okay, I'm stuttering. I need to start over. There were 3 injuries, obviously, not like real injuries, like you think it takes a player out completely. But so we had Devontae Smith. Saban said that he's going to be like a day-to-day kind of case right now. We had Henry Ruggs, who just kind of pulled a muscle in his leg.
I saw that.
He was actually playing before the game ended. So I think he just kind of landed on it wrong, and it kind of just caused him some temporary pain. They wanted to take a look at it, so he went to the locker room. But he came out and was playing. And then Tua, who had apparently been wearing a knee brace all week, slid on it a little bit wrong and kind of aggravated it. So they let Hurts play the entire second half. I think Tua manned the first possession, and that's when he slid on the knee wrong. So none of them, according to all the sources and stuff, none of the injuries are like really major, and like Tua could have played in that game, but there was absolutely no reason for him to do that. So, but I think this is the first time though that Alabama had to actually overcome some adversity, even though it wasn't adversity from another team; it was adversity from injuries. It's actually the worst kind, because you don't ever want to see that happen. But I think the defense really stepped it up, way better from last week. They held Missouri to just I think just 10 points. I don't think they got a garbage time score this game.
No.
So that would mean that we actually shut them out in the second half. And that's not even to say that we weren't giving them opportunities. We definitely were. As soon as those injuries started happening, particularly after the Henry Ruggs one, then our offense was kind of slowing down. We were calling a lot of run plays, and it looked like they were just trying to get out of the game as fast as they could. And Missouri's defense was actually rather impressive today. They haven't really been impressive all year, but they were definitely stepping up their game today. So we were actually giving them opportunities, but every time Drew Lock got the ball in his hand, we either made him mess up or he just messed it up himself. They couldn't really get anything going. I'm not sure how much of that is to attribute to the defense, but I got to imagine it's a fair bit, because Missouri is, while they're not thought of as a great team, they're kind of like, that Ole Miss mentality where they're thought that they're at least going to score a lot of points.
Sure.
And we didn't let them do that.
And
I think it was a really good game. I think we scored about 20 points under our average, but it was definitely a lot better game than last week against Arkansas. Nothing really got exposed. In fact, if anything, it showed that we were able to overcome some temporary injuries in our starting positions.
Absolutely. And you played a much better team, or a decidedly better team, than you did last week. And a team with a quarterback who is projected to be an NFL player and who has legitimate weapons. They're not elite, but they're really good players. The tight end's extremely good. And there are a number of players on the outside and at the running back position with Crockett and the other kid that are really good players. They can score points, and they score. Sure. Their offensive numbers, both the yardage and touchdowns and the point totals, both as a team and individually, are skewed versus FCS teams and group of 5 teams and the low end of the SEC. But they're still legitimate, and they put up points against most teams, like an Ole Miss. And they didn't against you guys.
Yep. It was really good. As far as just a general scope of the football picture today, I was a little disappointed that Wisconsin couldn't do anything against Michigan, but I don't really care that much, honestly. It's more of an anti-Jim Harbaugh thing than it is for anything else.
Sure.
I did not watch it, but I saw that Dwayne Haskins had like over 400 yards.
Yeah.
And Ohio State had about 30 points, I think. So that must mean every single one of those points came off Dwayne Haskins, if I'm not mistaken.
Ironically, that
is that true?
Ironically, that the replay of that game starting on FS1 right this second. Now, I have that game on DVR. I did not watch the game. I got home about 6:30 tonight from visiting my daughter in college, and I did not see the game. And I called a buddy on my way home, and we were talking about it. And then somebody had, it was DeAndre, called in, said that he caught some of the game. And he was surprised that Ohio State's offensive line looked as bad as it did. So, yeah, Ohio State, I don't know if you're familiar with their two running backs, J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber. They're both extremely good. Dobbins is the home run hitter. Weber's the in-between the tackles guys. They averaged 3.9 and 3.5 yards per carry in this game. So the offensive line apparently didn't do its job. Haskins hit on 33 of 44 for 412 and 3 touchdowns. So he got the job done. This is just an odd Ohio State team. Their offensive lines. I saw the Indiana game last week. It didn't perform well. They couldn't run the ball, but they're throwing it all over the place, and they've got gifted wide receivers. This is probably going to carry them through the Big Ten, but man, they're going to have issues against certainly Alabama and a few other teams if they can't get the offensive line corrected in the running game. Yeah, it was a 17-14 game in the third quarter.
Yeah, I did see that on the score update. Was kind of snickering at it, to be honest.
Sure.
Well, yeah, that's pretty much it for the landscape. Hey, I just want to ask you something real quick before I let you go. This is a moot point now because West Virginia got annihilated. But what did you think in this hypothetical situation? Because it was a possibility, a slim one, but it was a possibility up until today. If there were 4 13-0 champions, naming Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, and West Virginia,
sure, all
of them never lost, did not lose a single game, and they all won their conference championship. And there's also a 12-0 Notre Dame. It is, in my opinion, that you can't leave a completely undefeated champion out. And then, in my opinion, that one scenario would leave an undefeated Notre Dame out. Just want to get your thoughts on that.
So I made a statement earlier this week that was very close to what you just stated. I kind of spoke straight at Notre Dame to say, you have to do a little bit more work than other conference champions because you don't have the 13th data point, and everybody else's 13th data point is not just another data point. It's against typically the second or third best team in the conference. It's against another really good team, and they have chosen to play in a conference. You have chosen not to play in a conference. Therefore, you have done that to yourself, and you play one less game. And that one less game, I understand that you schedule difficult, but the one less game is against a difficult opponent for the other teams that you're competing against for this playoff spot. So the interesting part in that is, in your scenario, West Virginia did not get to play NC State, so they would actually be 12-0 because the Hurricane wiped out the NC State game, which would, of course, been a really good win for them. What do I think should happen, or what do I think would have happened? What do I think should have happened would have been that Notre Dame would have been penalized for playing one less game and not in a conference, and that the conference championship would be rewarded for those 4 teams. That's what I think should have happened. What would have happened? Wow, I think the committee really would have, I think Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson would have been very safe, and it would have been, yes, a spot between West Virginia and Notre Dame. And I think style points would have played a huge factor into it, an enormous factor.
You see, and first of all, everyone who debated with on this, called me crazy and just refused to listen to any story other than that a undefeated Notre Dame is getting in, period, in the story. It's never not going to happen. They didn't want to hear any kind of counter argument to it. My thing here, and I actually do believe that the committee would have gone this way. Everyone's argument about an undefeated Notre Dame, oh my God, they're just automatically getting in. It's all based on one thing. The fact that, quote unquote, they're Notre Dame. Well, what does that even mean anymore? I'm sorry. This whole brand thing just doesn't matter in this day and age. First of all, it's been forever since they've won a national title.
Yep.
No one cares. No one. People want to act like they care, but no one cares. And I don't think the committee cares. And
I hope not.
Here's the kicker. I think that in that scenario, the committee would have kept them out. They would have been hoping that one of those teams would lose. They don't want to do this. But I think they would have kept them out. And you know why? Because if you put a Notre Dame, because this is how it would happen. Come December, the first week of December, all these teams go out and play. Let's say Notre Dame just happened to be in the top 4 at that time. Let's put them at 4. And like West Virginia's at 5. If Notre Dame is sitting on the couch while West Virginia goes out and in this scenario manages to beat a really tough Oklahoma or Texas in the Big 12 championship, you really think that they're just going to say, good job, you're still not going? It didn't matter what you did. You see, because that would start just a monster debate, in my opinion, about what's the purpose of even being in a conference then. Because Notre Dame gets so much benefits, they think, because they're not in one. They get to keep all their money. They get to make their own schedules. They can make them easy or hard. They can do whatever they want with it. And there's a lot of programs out there who would have looked at something like that and been like, well, wait a second. If you're going to let these guys in on a 12-0 schedule, so our conference championship, our extra risk that we have to take doesn't mean anything, well, shoot, I don't have to do this then. There's plenty of programs out there who are big enough to self-sustain. Alabama, USC, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Texas, just to name a few. And I don't think they would have wanted to start something like that. Now, granted, that didn't happen. This is all a moot point anyway. And it was extremely unlikely that will ever happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted to get your opinions on that. Because I've been being told that I'm crazy all week long for thinking that.
Well, some of those people probably went to the television angle as well, depending on how particular portions of the college football nation believe that ESPN and the television networks have control over the committee or a say in trying to persuade them. So they obviously would want Notre Dame in over West Virginia, you would think. I think the committee...
How much they complain about the committee, you don't think they have that much control?
I hope they don't have any, and I don't know that, but I would hope not. I would also hope that the committee would not be swayed by brand names, but there's human bias involved in it. There's no way to get around that, but I would hope that they would try not to be biased by a brand name of a Notre Dame, Ohio State, Alabama, etc., over a West Virginia, Washington, whomever would be competing for a spot, and they would just look at level of play, performance, resume, etc. Again, I would get back to, if they would select Notre Dame, they could fall back on Notre Dame beat teams from all the conferences. They beat generally quality teams from every conference, whether that was USC and Stanford from the Pac-12, Michigan from the Big Ten, and the teams that they play in the ACC, and even Vanderbilt if you wanted to include them. Whereas West Virginia, unfortunately, by no fault of its own, was robbed of playing a good NC State team out of the ACC. Therefore, the only thing we know about West Virginia is that they can beat teams in the Big 12.
And Tennessee.
And they beat Tennessee, yes, who Auburn wasn't able to beat. So I guess that tells us something. That's right, they beat Tennessee, yes. Which to West Virginia's credit, they tried to Mississippi and NC State.
Okay, yeah,
That's a pretty strong non-conference schedule right there. It should be most years.
They played nine conference games, and they played two They played two non-conference Power 5 games, and what does that leave them with? Just one cupcake school?
Yes, that's it. That's it.
That's how you do it right there.
And then they got to turn around and rematch against somebody that they most likely beat in a Big 12 championship game, which we all know is difficult, i.e. Auburn, Georgia last year.
There's a rumor that both Georgia and Alabama lost to Auburn on purpose because they want Gus Malzahn to stay there. And it worked. They're stuck with him.
Yeah, he got his big contract extension based on 3 weeks of play.
Got a contract extension just in time to go blow it to Georgia and then to embarrass themselves against Central Florida, which might not be that embarrassing in hindsight, but it was last year.
And so they've lost 3 games, and they still have Georgia. They still have Alabama. So, yeah, they could be looking at a pretty ugly marginal season. Yeah, 6-6. Wow.
Yeah,
that's pretty rough.
Not getting that much prettier for the barn.
No.
For the rest of the season.
Not at all. Wow.
All right, man.
All right. Appreciate the call.
I'm going to let you go now.
Yeah.
Thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Reasonable Gump, which is a well-stated handle by him. We enjoy the Alabama football talk, and to get it from him, because I got to say, I've been checked out on Alabama because they haven't played any competitive games. So the Missouri game, I saw about 10 or 15 plays. The Arkansas game, every game Alabama plays, I see about 10 or 15 or 20 plays because I switch to them during the breaks. But they don't play anybody decent, so I don't get to see much Alabama football. But I will against LSU, of course. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Who's on the line?
Hey, this is Mike again from Miami. How's it going, buddy?
Hey, Mike, I'm doing just fine. What's going on?
Well, the Canes went down today.
Sure.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Everything in front of them. If we'd have just won our game like we should have, we'd have been in a good shape. But, things happen, and that's the way it goes in college football. So my question to you is, what is the state of the ACC right now? You got a strong Clemson team that's just dominating week in and week out. They had the little hiccup with Syracuse. And then, Miami looks like they're coming into their own, and we bring a comeback game to Florida State, and then all of a sudden we go into Virginia and we play terrible play calling by Coach Mark Richt. I mean, it is what it is. I'm not going to harp on Miami too much. I'm a Miami fan. It is what it is. But what is the state of the ACC? I mean, I just want to get your opinion. What is the state of the ACC right now in the state of college football?
I thought the ACC was the worst conference in college football up until about 2013 or 14, and had a remarkable resurgence in about 2 to 3 years, culminated by, as you well know, going 10-3 with a national championship in 2016. A lot of really impressive bowl wins, not just from the upper crust, but from the likes of Wake Forest and others, winning bowl games against good teams. And then I thought there was going to be an interesting evaluation to be made last season between the SEC, the ACC, and the Big Ten to determine best conference. And going into this season, look at what the ACC has done out of conference. It's borderline embarrassing. So Duke has your best non-conference wins, because the Clemson win over Texas A&M. Texas A&M is the best team an ACC team has beaten. They are the best team that an ACC team has beaten out of conference by far. Texas A&M's that team, but it took your best team to beat the 5th or 6th best team in the SEC, and to beat them by 2 points on a failed 2-point conversion on the road. So that's not impressive. Duke actually has the most impressive wins by going to Baylor and winning by 3 scores, by going to Northwestern and winning by 2 scores, and beating Army by 20 points. Duke actually has the best wins in the ACC. Other than that, my goodness, obviously the Virginia Tech situation's an embarrassment, losing by 2 touchdowns to Old Dominion. Unfortunately, I would have loved, as we all would have, to see NC State play West Virginia. That would have been a great game, I think, but we didn't get to see that. Purdue's a team that's not tearing up the Big Ten, that's for sure, and they beat Boston College by 17 points. Florida State, of course, has been a train wreck, both inside and outside the conference.
And Miami's not helping the situation with what they pulled off tonight. So,
no. So you can look at it one of 2 ways. You could either, once the teams are playing inside the conference, then you can just say, well, the conference is either so tough that they beat each other, or it's that marginal that they beat each other. But yes, that doesn't do the ACC any favors, because you want upper crust, as we talked about a couple weeks ago on this show with a few callers. You don't want the Alabama scenario from a couple years ago where it's just Alabama and then you've got like nobody in the top 15 other than them. But you also don't want the muddled mess of what's been the Pac-12 in recent years, where you get a bunch of 8-4, 7-5 teams and nobody's really that good. You want like 3 or 4, like 10-win, 11-win teams that are in the top 10 or 12 in the country. That's what looks good. And yes, you don't have that. Now with Miami going down, you don't have that. With Virginia Tech losing outside the conference like they have, those were the 2 schools that could join Clemson, and of course Florida State showed us on opening night that they weren't going to be a factor. You've got a 1-team league right now, and maybe NC State changes that. We'll see on Saturday, but they haven't played anyone to show that yet. Right now, Clemson isn't even impressing anyone, but we know that they're really good, really talented, and they've got a top 5 roster in the country. But you've got a 1-team league right now, and that perception's not going to change unless NC State beats Clemson. And I don't know that you want that to happen as an ACC fan. I think you just want Clemson to win on out and get to the playoff, because if NC State beats Clemson and then NC State loses, then you've got a muddled mess where NC State with a loss is still going to get to the ACC championship game, and you may get the entire league run out of the college football playoff. You're not going to change perception nationally with this league until you get to postseason play. There's no way to do it right now.
No, and I agree with you. And, you know, and I'm disappointed. I'm a Miami fan, obviously. I've been calling on the show before. And Miami goes into Virginia. We don't get it done. And there's so many teams in the top 10, top 15 that went down today. And that was our chance to kind of move up and, you know, say, hey, we're here. And you know what? The way we played today and the way we performed against Virginia, I think we showed the nation that we're not ready to be in that conversation. And I think as Miami fans, everyone needs to come to that reality and say, we're not there yet. And so I'm just curious, if we can't get it done versus Virginia, you know, where do we stand nationally? You know, and that's a concerning feeling, wondering, you know, next season, what does our schedule look like? What are we going into next season? If we went, like, we just look so weak as an ACC conference, especially as some of the top dogs that are in our conference going down. And I don't blame the rest of the country to look down on us at this point.
Well, it's a very fair point and very reasonable comments out of a Miami fan. And I'm not picking on Miami fans. I'm just saying, for the fan base of any fan base, for you to step up for your particular team and just tell it like it is definitely a fair commentary. What we need to be able to see. So Miami didn't have the opportunity once they lost to LSU, and once Florida State proved to be not that good, they didn't have the opportunity to say, oh, we just beat Penn State, or we just beat Oklahoma, or we just beat somebody of that caliber. But what you needed to do was beat Georgia Tech and Duke and North Carolina and and Pitt and Virginia and beat all those teams consecutively, and then all of a sudden show up at 8-1 or something like that and make your way up the rankings. And again, as you mentioned, losing to Virginia. So either that's a harbinger of things to come, and this coastal race is going to be just a mess because you're going to lose another game. You're going to go to Boston College and lose, or you're going to lose at Virginia Tech, and there's going to be more of this. And who knows who's going to come out of this. Or maybe that's your Pitt. Maybe that game's your Pitt, and you're generally the team that you were last year, which is a good team, a top 15 to 20 team. And that Virginia game was your on-the-road Pitt game, and you'll run the table, and you'll take care of business in Blacksburg, and you'll win the Coastal, and most likely lose the ACC championship game by 2 or 3 touchdowns.
Agreed.
That's probably what's going to happen.
And I agree with you, and I'm not disputing that at all. And I mean, I don't know if you watched the game tonight and watch what happened, but I mean, we go to N'Kosi Perry as our quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
We go into a game against last week. We're down by 20 coming out of the half. Oh, not 20 coming out of the half, but basically coming out of 20 out of the half. We stick with N'Kosi Perry. We come back and get the W. And then this week in the second quarter, we're down by 10, and our coach decides to go to our redshirt senior quarterback and Malik Rozier. I mean, what does that tell the upcoming class? And can I get your opinion on it at all? On, you know, what do you think about that? I just really want to get your opinion. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
My opinion is that despite all the respect I have for Mark Richt, and I do think he's a capable coach and comes under undue fire at times, I seem to be headed down the same road as you do. I think it's very clear cut that it would be different if Malik Rozier, and I'll pronounce his name correctly, it's Rozier, but it's a hard habit to break. Malik Rozier.
I was trying to be politically correct.
Is that it would be different if, you know, you see it in the NFL all the time, at least in decades gone by, where there was that crusty veteran on the bench, like a Don Strock. I don't know if I'm going way too far back for you, but guys on the bench that could be counted upon. And they weren't good enough to be the starter, but if there was an issue, if there was a situation, an injury, and they could be relied upon. Malik Rozier has that type of experience, but he's proven incapable. He's not trustworthy. He's not reliable. He's not any more reliable than the guy that's only had 2 starts. As you mentioned, you were only down 10 points. And I know N'Kosi Perry made a couple of awful throws, but those aren't any different than the throws that we see Malik Rozier make. And now you're setting yourself up for just this quarterback situation that's kind of a mess. He didn't lead the team back to victory. So I don't know if Richt reverts back to saying, well, I just tried Rozier, but he didn't get it done. He's not going to state that part of it, but so Perry's our starting quarterback, and he will remain the starting quarterback. I just felt that a change was needed for that particular situation. Or certainly Rozier didn't do anything to earn the job back. So at this point,
we go back to Perry, and that's my next question. But you know what? I don't want to bore you with Miami talk. I know this is a national channel. So my last and final question for you is, you know, Notre Dame, they've come out, they've proven themselves week in and week out. They've won the games they've needed to win, and nobody can argue that. And everyone on the national stage can say what they want about Notre Dame. They've done what they've needed to do to put themselves in the position they're in. Now, my next question is, how do you feel about Notre Dame being the so-called chosen one that doesn't need to be into a conference that picks the best team to play them in what I would call a college football semifinal type of game? If, let's say, you know, Notre Dame's basketball team is in the ACC. Well, let's say Notre Dame had to play Clemson in a conference game to get the ACC conference title. You know, how do you feel about that? And that's my next question. That's all I have, and I appreciate you, and you're the best, and I watch you every day. But that's my next question for you.
I appreciate that, sir. Thanks so much. So you're an interesting Miami caller in that, number one, you have a very reasonable take on the Miami situation, and I'm not dissing other Miami callers, but I'm just stating that as us all being fanatics for our particular team. But number two, that you're actually sticking up for Notre Dame. I find that very interesting. So Notre Dame will play one less game than conference championship teams this year. They have the lack of a 13th data point. I don't have an issue with Notre Dame's schedule. I think Notre Dame has always gone out and scheduled more difficult than 80 or 90% of the country on a regular basis.
I agree. I agree with you.
They go out there, and if there's a dip in their schedule any particular year, it certainly has nothing to do with their intent. If USC's down or Stanford's down or somebody else is down, it has nothing to do with them. Their schedule, you know, if 2/3 of the programs on their schedule this season were where they're supposed to be and typically are, their schedule would be brutal this year. If Florida State, for example, was what they typically are. I do think that Notre Dame needs to do a little bit more work. They need to prove a little bit more because of the lack of a conference championship and a 13th data point. They've made that decision. The ACC would love to have Notre Dame as part of the ACC. Obviously, they let in all the non-revenue sports. That
would help the whole ACC.
Yes. So Notre Dame's made that choice. So I think I pointed it out recently that my message to Notre Dame would be, of course, you have a legitimate shot to make the college football playoff, but if your resume is close, if it's a close call between your resume and somebody else's, we are going to take the other resume and the other team because they have won a 13th game and won a conference championship, and you have not. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, it does. And I'm just wondering if the college football playoff committee sees it the way we see it, because you always feel like Notre Dame is the poster child, and they're going to get away with, oh, well, you know, they won this and they won that, and you know, you always wonder, well, what if, you know, you have Power 5 conferences. And there's a lot of good teams in these Power 5 conferences. Well, what if Notre Dame had to play in one of those conference championships? You know, how would they fare against a Penn State or a Clemson or a LSU going into that conference championship? You know, you always wonder that, and that's in the back of your mind. And I understand they do schedule well, and they do always put good teams on the schedule, but you really never know who is going to be the best team in each conference. So I always wonder, well, what if they were in the conference and they had to play Clemson or LSU or one of these Power 5 conferences? How would they hold up if they sustained a one loss early in the season, and then they have to go into a conference championship and play another game? Would they get in there? That's the thing that we question. But you know, I understand they've beaten the teams they need to beat. In the situation we're in, they're in it, and it looks like they're on the road to get in there. And you know, we are where we are. But it was just a out of left field question that I had a question about. But it is what it is, and we're here now, and you know, it is what it is.
So we've only seen the College Football Playoff Selection Committee faced with two decisions in which they were really weighing a decision between, well, actually, I'm going to make it three. In 2014, there was the Ohio State, TCU, Baylor decision. And they opted for the Glamour program. Now, I'm not saying that they made the decision because Ohio State was the Glamour program, but it turned out that their selection was... Pardon me?
I said they were probably better.
Yeah, well, they won the championship, so they validated their decision.
Yeah.
But of course, Ohio State's by far the more attractive of the three teams. By far, it's not even close. Now, we don't know if that weighed into their decision or they just looked at the resumes, the track records, the performance, and said Ohio State's the best team. It doesn't matter that they're Ohio State or they're Kansas State. The next time that happened was Ohio State versus Penn State, and they selected Ohio State, where it was a difficult decision between a conference champion that won the head-to-head battle versus a team that had a better record and a better resume because they actually beat Wisconsin and Michigan and Oklahoma. And then the third time that happened was the time that it was a bit different because it was probably what are currently the two biggest brands in the sport, Alabama and Ohio State, and they chose Alabama. Now, we don't know if the glamour portion of that factored into those decisions. We can only conjecture. And I don't know, and I hope it doesn't. I hope I hope TV ratings don't have anything to do with selections, and I hope wanting to put the best brand in the game in the playoff doesn't have anything to do with the decision. If it was West Virginia winning the Big 12 and Duke winning the ACC and Texas A&M in the SEC and Wisconsin in the Big 10, that they would still look at those teams objectively versus a Notre Dame and not say, well, Notre Dame's going to knock out one of those teams because we need to get a brand name in here that people are going to watch. I hope that's not under consideration, or we do have some issues with this system.
Yeah, and I agree. And I just go back to the championship a few years ago when Notre Dame played Alabama, and it was just not even fair on the field. And I wonder if Notre Dame wasn't Notre Dame, would they have been there?
Well, that's a great point that you make. Because that particular year, Notre Dame earned that spot. They were 12-0, but anybody who watched the games, I picked Alabama to win that game by like 28 points or whatever it was. I was close to picking the score because I thought this is going to be an annihilation. We just watched the two best teams in the country play, Alabama and Georgia, and Ohio State was not eligible that year.
And I have a funny feeling that may be the situation this year. And don't get me wrong, I'm a diehard Miami fan, but I said this from the beginning of the season. Miami may be getting back to where we need to be, but if we lined up against Alabama, let's be honest, it's going to get ugly. So, Alabama, they are who they are, and I think the rest of the country knows who they are. And I'm just afraid. I'm not afraid. If it happens, if Notre Dame lines up against Alabama in the college football playoff, it's going to get ugly real fast because they're just not built like Alabama's built. And I don't know if anyone in the country is built like Alabama's built, but I know Notre Dame dang sure isn't. So it's one of those years that I think it's going to be a runaway. But what do you think the chances are that Notre Dame ever joins a conference?
Well, before we get to that, you bring up a great point because with all of Alabama's success since Nick Saban took over and they won their first national championship in 2009, they haven't embarrassed other teams in national championship games. They've just won the national championship games. That was the one where they they played Texas. Texas lost Colt McCoy in the first series and had to play with a backup quarterback, Garrett Gilbert, and they still had a 24-21 game with about 5 minutes left. Of course, they beat LSU, but that's an in-conference game. The other games that they won, they lost to Ohio State in a playoff. Of course, they had a great game against Clemson that they won, and they had a great game against Clemson that they lost. They played a great game against Georgia. So Alabama did not steamroll in any of those other playoff scenarios, or at least in the championship games, except when they played Notre Dame. Now, thinking back to that Notre Dame team, they went 12-0, and they had a string of scares in that season. They beat Pitt because Pitt missed a field goal in overtime, and Pitt was no good. They beat Stanford because there was a controversial call at the goal line in overtime in terms of did they break the plane or not break the plane. Michigan lost 5 games that year, and if Denard Robinson was actually a quarterback and not a running back playing quarterback who threw 4 interceptions, they wouldn't have beaten Michigan. They had like a string of narrow wins, and they went 12-0. But to your point, if they would have been 12-0 in a conference, and then they would have had to go play Wisconsin or Oklahoma or somebody in a championship game, maybe they would have gotten exposed before they got in to play Alabama.
That's my point. So are they ever going to go into a conference? I don't know.
It doesn't appear, not in the near future, they're not. They have a long contract standing with NBC right now as an independent, and obviously this arrangement with the ACC is not that old.
So I feel like Notre Dame every year is saying, you know what? We're going to take the dice and we're going to roll it. And I think if we schedule a team like USC and Stanford and these certain teams, and they're having a down year, and we just play our other games, we're going to make it to the fucking playoff. Sorry to curse, but I feel like they don't have to worry about that conference champion. If they just schedule these certain teams that the nation will look at and say, you know what? They beat USC. They beat Stanford. You know what? And they went undefeated. Let's put them in the playoff. I just feel like that's unfair because there's certain teams that have a down year, and I feel like every third or fourth year, Notre Dame is going to get that schedule where if they're halfway decent and they beat these 2 or 3 teams, they're going to get in the college football playoff. And I just don't think that's a fair shake. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. And we have to face them. And I don't think Notre Dame is all that. And I think when they walked into Miami last year and Miami beat them 40-something to whatever,
yep,
I don't think Miami was all that at the time. I think we were playing a high. We were playing well. We had them at home in a Hard Rock Stadium, and it was loud, and we got them flustered, and we beat them. But the next week, we go and lose to Pitt on the road. And so we just exposed ourselves again, and I think we exposed Pitt. And I don't think Pitt or Notre Dame is who they're all cracked up to be because Pitt almost beat Notre Dame today at their home field. So I feel like Notre Dame is going to get exposed quickly, but I'm afraid they're going to take up a spot in the college football playoff to get exposed, and it's going to take another team out of it that might have a shot to get into the championship and then eventually get beat by Alabama by 21 points, because I just think they're better than everyone in college football today.
Mm-hmm. It sure appears that way. It'll be interesting to see them actually play someone with a pulse to see if that's the case, and that's going to be LSU. But I would not be surprised if Alabama wins that game by 3 touchdowns. The Notre Dame situation, the one defense I will take with Notre Dame is that look around the country and find me the team other than Alabama that's just steamrolling through. So everybody's getting a scare at some point. So Notre Dame's no different. And last year, I think, as what sounds like a very reasonable Miami fan, that although you should have been overjoyed, ecstatic, bragging rights, been trash talking, whatever you like to do, following that 41-8 game against Notre Dame, because that was a dominant game. It wasn't even close. It was a butt kicking to the nth degree. When you look at the totality of the two teams over the course of a season, they're very similar teams. And I got to think that either that was just a bad matchup for Notre Dame, or if they played 10 times, that was the aberration. Like, Notre Dame would have killed them once, Miami would have killed them once, and the other 8 games would have gone down to the last 3 minutes. Because Notre Dame, they beat a really good NC State team by 3 touchdowns. They beat USC by 5 touchdowns. They beat LSU in a bowl game. You know, they looked the part, not like a great team. They didn't look like they belonged in the playoff, but they looked like a legitimate top 10 to 12 team in the country the rest of the season. That was the one game that they didn't.
Exactly. And I think Miami got some, you know, Miami since the Orange Bowl, like 2003, 2004, Miami hasn't been great. So I think last year we're on a roll. We're undefeated. And I think all the Miami fans in South Florida said, oh, Notre Dame's coming to town. And I think every Miami fan in South Florida showed up to the stadium. And I think we had a legit home field advantage. And I think maybe Notre Dame wasn't ready, or Miami, the players were shocked. And I think we kind of surprised Notre Dame and caught them off guard. And I think the game just went downhill for them fast. And I think the game just got out of hand for Notre Dame really quick. And I don't think that was indicative of how good of a team that Notre Dame was. Miami just happened to play above their head, and I think Notre Dame played below their standard. And it was just an over-the-head game for Miami. And it was fun being a Miami fan, experiencing that, and it was awesome. But I think Miami fans got ahead of themselves, saying, we're back, we're going to the national title game, not looking at the roster and looking what we have at quarterback. And I think Notre Dame kind of got below themselves. But I think if you sit back and, like you said, you play that game 10 times, Miami might win it 7 or 6 out of 10 times, just based on the roster. And, I'm a realist, so I understand that. But I think Notre Dame is a great football team. And, we'll just have to see what happens, the rest of the year. But, last year it was fun being on the winning side of that. It was awesome. It was exciting. It was great. And I think Miami is on the trend of getting up in that top 10, top 15 echelon of college football. But I think we got a lot of work to do. And I don't think that anyone thought last year or this year watching our football team thinks that we can contend for a national title against Alabama or Ohio State. We're just not there yet. And so we have to keep recruiting. We have to keep coaching better, which we're not doing well, which is another subject. But, Notre Dame coming in here, it was a bad situation for him. It was a bad situation for him.
Great, sir. I appreciate the call. He had some great comments to make.
All right, buddy. I appreciate it, and thank you. You're awesome, and I will continue to tell everyone about you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the support. You have a great weekend.
All right, you too, buddy.
All right. Good phone calls tonight. All right. What are we looking at here? 3:14 in the morning. All right. I'm going to wrap it up here. My son actually texted me tonight. Now, my son is 21 years old. Doesn't live with me now. Lived with me up until about 3 months ago. Doesn't live with me now. Usually comes over sometime on Saturday and on Sunday and watches football, and we grill out or we get some pizza or whatever. And my son played baseball through his early years up through high school. And, during that time, if you are a dad and you've had kids, whether they be daughters or sons, and they were involved in sports, like my daughter played softball all the way through high school, you know what the grind is, and the grind is fun, and you love developing your kids, especially when they're in that 4, 5, or 6-year-old range, and you teach them how to field a ground ball and how to throw and do all those things, and then you see them develop and really love the sport. And my son really loved baseball and loved to play baseball, and he was totally into it. And again, played through the age of 17 or 18. And to get a text from him today, because he didn't come over today because I went out to Rhode Island to visit my daughter in college, that he said, why don't we hit the field tomorrow and just throw the ball, hit ground balls, hit fly balls, take some batting practice, do that sort of thing. So it's 3:15 in the morning, and he's going to be here at like 10 in the morning, which, if you know anything about my schedule, man, that's like 5 nights worth of sleep for me. So I shouldn't have any issues there. But I will let you know that what I was preparing to do before I struck up this live stream and talked forever was that I've looked at the Big Ten, the ACC, and the SEC, and I will get to the Big 12 and the Pac-12 as well. And for example, I've looked at the SEC and thought, okay, what are the playoff scenarios? Who are the wild cards? Don't forget about this team. What about a 2-loss champion? Well, that's probably not going to happen, of course, with Alabama undefeated right now. what was my preseason pick? How does that look? And what's going to happen? Do I need to skew or change or adjust that prediction now? Looked at the Big Ten, the same thing. What's the possibility of 2 teams getting in? What happened with Penn State and Wisconsin losing? Most likely that really hurts the 2-team scenario for the Big Ten. What's the best case scenario for each league? What's the worst case scenario for each league? Who's the wild card? What was my preseason pick? How well is it doing? Do I need to adjust my prediction? And what is going to happen? So I've done that again for the SEC, the ACC, and the Big Ten. I got to look at the Big Ten or the Big 12 and the Pac-12. I've got to put together my top 25 that makes sense. My conference rankings, I've done those. I've got the notes there. I've got to cut those videos. Go over to SG1 Sports when you get a chance. Last week, they had me do a Michigan-Wisconsin preview and prediction. Washington, Oregon, and I forget the other game. Plus, we also did our top 3 picks with Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info. So I've been asked by SD1 Sports to do some work for them. So each and every week, I'm going to release for them at least 3 Big Ten video previews and predictions. Also, a live stream that's going to start on SG1 Sports this Friday. So I'll give you more details on that. And also next Sunday, a live stream on SG1 Sports. They have like 21,000 subscribers to my measly 5,500. So they're a little bit more equipped to give me some more exposure, give our platform more exposure, and also a little bit of compensation. So we are teaming up with SD1 Sports, and I'll have more details on that. All right, we appreciate you guys stopping by, and hopefully I didn't miss anything on the live chat. I will give it a quick glance in case you guys had anything for me. You guys usually carry on these conversations apart from me and do just fine. But I will give it a look. It's funny because I can invest 14 hours into college football on a Saturday, which I didn't necessarily today, but still about 8. And typically, like I say, from noon until 2 o'clock in the morning. And I still feel like, well, man, I need to look at that recap and that. I want to look at the Illinois-Purdue box score. I kept seeing that score on the bottom line, Purdue 46, Illinois 7. And I kept thinking, I want to look at that recap. I want to look at the team stats. I want to look at the box score. Yes, I am nuts. I want to look at the Purdue-Illinois box score. I can't wait to look at it. But I get so far behind with all these games going on. And this is the great frustration with college football. There were like 15 or 16 really good games today. At least they turned out to be really good games, or they were important matchups that didn't turn out to be good games, but they were almost must see at one point. And yeah, you can only catch up with so much. So I appreciate you guys. And I appreciate the comments as well. I don't think you guys realize the comments that you guys make both help the analytical portion of this. The more comments, the more YouTube understands and processes that the station, the channel is popular. The more the comments, the more it will drive my videos to suggested videos. But also, more than that, far beyond that, are that the comments that you have to make, whether it's just debating college football, asking me questions, getting into conversations with other commenters on the videos, or if you're at times, and this happens multiple times a day, that I receive a compliment like I did on the latest phone call. You guys have no idea how that inspires me to get up tomorrow to do more. And despite going to the regular job tomorrow at 5 o'clock in the afternoon until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, coming home and churning out content for the channel. So I appreciate it. All right. Swampy McGee, thank you. Mike Escobar, I haven't seen your name in a long time, so thanks for joining us. Yeah, later to everyone. It's been late. Swampy McGee looking at the Purdue offense. Yeah, they scored up big against Lovie Smith today. hey, if I don't mention your name, obviously it's impossible. And I think you guys understand that I try to get to an array of comments. I try to kind of scan the comments and speak to some people maybe that I haven't spoken to before, or obviously if somebody has a really good point, then I'll address that. Or if they have a criticism, I like to address that. Typically, if somebody calls me a moron or an idiot, I love to address those comments. And some of you just love to say, hey, go Canes or go Irish, and I just let that go. And but still make those comments in the comment section. I appreciate it. All right, guys, thank you so much, everybody who's on the live stream and the live chat. And I'll be back tomorrow with top 25 that makes sense, conference rankings, conference races breakdown, and my playoff scenarios for each and every conference as we move it into week 8. The storyline unfolds as we go through the college football season. It's like no other. And hopefully you will stay tuned to Mark Rogers TV right here, the voice of college football. See you guys tomorrow.